We are in Tuskule, Vilnius, a memorial place dedicated to the Soviet victims. What did it happen here between 1944 and 1947?
So, Tuskulėnai is actually a very special place in the history of Vilnius because here it was a part of our kind of royal palace, even from the 16th century. So this place, it was a manor which belonged to the royal palace. In 17th century, it came to some very noble families of Lithuania, for instance, Pacai, and the owners were all the time changing, but it was kind of a place of nobility, of culture, and it was a very, very beautiful place. But unfortunately, in the 20th century, the role of this place changed considerably, and because, as you know, the Soviet occupation started, then the Nazi occupation, then the Soviet occupation again, and from 1944 this place was used as a mass grave for victims which were killed by the Soviets. It was actually administered by the Soviet institution called NKGB at that time, but it was the same institution as NKVD before the war and what was KGB doing after the war, so it was basically the same system, what was Cheka in the very beginning. And so the executions were made not here. People were not killed in this place. They were just brought here with big trucks, with cars, and then buried here in mass graves. Normally, many people in one big hole, in one big grave, not individually. Also, what is interesting about these victims, people were taken from their clothes, or they were buried whether totally naked or only with their underwear. Their personal belongings were taken. It was because on the one hand, nobody could recognize these people, and also sometimes their personal things were stolen by the Soviet officials. And who were those people? Actually, they were not just random people, but they were all recognized by Soviet law. Soviet law was, of course, very unjust system of law and justice, but they were recognized as criminals. Mostly of them were political prisoners they were sentenced using the so-called Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code. And yes, majority of these people were the resistance fighters of Lithuanian armed resistance, but also some Polish people from Armia Krajova. And for instance, people who were in 1941 participated in so-called June uprising in Lithuania. So several different groups. Among them were also criminals, real criminals who committed some serious criminal acts, and also some of them were people who were responsible for the Holocaust in Lithuania. So very broad aspect of victims, very broad spectrum of victims, nationalities as well, mostly Lithuanians, but also there were Poles, for instance, Russians, Ukrainians, and other nationalities. So that's basically the story.
Who were people killed by the Soviets?
So there were found 724 people killed here in general, a total number of people during this period, and as I said, mostly of them were the political prisoners, people who opposed in one or another way the Soviet authorities, or people who were treated as the enemies by the Soviet regime. For instance, because they were members of some political parties in the interwar period, or other reasons why Soviets just called people enemies. From these people, only few were female, 4 or 5, and most of them were male people. And there were also real criminals among these people. For instance, some people who were responsible for Nazi crimes, or people who were collaborating with Nazi or belonged to Nazi structures. So that's a part, a small, not a big part of them, but mostly, as I mentioned, that was Lithuanian resistance fighters, and also some people who were just treated enemies, not because their actions, but because who they were. Such example could be one bishop also who was killed by the Soviets in the NKVD prison and brought here from this prison. The prison is now in Gediminas Street and Aukų Street in Vilnius. So this priest Borisevičius actually never done any act of armed resistance, any really active oppositional activities. He was just saying in church that Soviet authorities not just because they are violating the right of religion and so on. And yes, he had some very, very small contacts with partisans, but very, very minor contacts. And he could not even by Soviet law be treated as a criminal, even by this unjust Soviet law. But anyway, because he was a bishop, because he belonged to church, he was an enemy. And that's why he was sentenced by that sentence, and he was killed and later buried here with all other victims. What is also important to say about the Soviet methods of death penalty, that most people were killed by shooting. Even there was a possibility to hang them, but it was not in all cases effective. They were seeking for the most effective way, so they were just killed, shot. But as archaeological excavations actually revealed, not all of them were only shot. Some were actually tortured, for instance, stabbed by perhaps knife or perhaps some other things. Some of them were beaten. So it was not only just to kill people to carry out this death sentence, but also sometimes these people who were killing people here, they were also torturing people. And what is also important to say that these perpetrators, employees of Soviet repressive structures, they were also doing it normally being drunk. So they were drinking alcohol, and that maybe helped them to deal with this very, very bad task. And yes, people were never killed here. They were just brought here from the KGB prison, what is now called the KGB prison in Vilnius, but it was at that time at KGB prison anyway, Soviet secret structures, and there they had a killing room, a room for the death sentences, but actually they could not bury people somewhere around or to found a place for the mass grave somewhere around, because it was the city center as it is today. So they had to find some more distant place, and at the Soviet period, post-war period, this place was not so much, didn't have so much inhabitants as it does today. So that was no district of Žirmūnai. It was just a small, several houses, but in general it seemed like just a green place, some kind of wood. So it was more or less a secret, because they wanted to hide this crime, what they were doing. The Soviets really wanted to hide this crime, and that's why they chose this kind of more secret, more hidden place. And also near here was so-called Šiaurės miestelis. Šiaurės miestelis is the place where the Red Army, Soviet Army, had its territory, and they were actually, it was their territory, secret territory. So that's why these structures, repressive structures, could collaborate with the army and ask their help. And it was basically military territory and secret territory here during the Soviet times.
What was the situation in Vilnius those years?
Well, the situation in Vilnius was very, very, very difficult in these post-war years, and because of the several reasons. First of all, in interwar period, Vilnius was a completely different city. It then belonged to Poland, but the most important thing is that the social system and the society was totally different, and there were many people living who were Jews, who were Polish people, like majority of the inhabitants were not Lithuanians. And after war, this situation started to change. First of all, because Vilnius really suffered from Holocaust. Many Jewish people were killed here. Like almost all Vilnius Jewish population was killed during Holocaust. So it lost really a huge part of its inhabitants. And of course, it lost all this Jewish district lost its population. Also, those houses were taken by someone else. Also, the big synagogue was destroyed, and so on. So many changes in the topography of Vilnius, in the buildings. Also, Vilnius suffered from the war. So many people were killed and buildings destroyed, meaning. For instance, the street of Vokiečių Street, German street, so this street looked completely different. It was just a small street, but all its houses were so much destroyed that the Soviets decided not to rebuild them, but build something new and make a bigger street out of this smaller street. So that city was actually just recovering step by these destructions of the war and trying to come back in a normal way of life. But of course it was not possible during the Stalinism and during this occupation and the Soviet regime. But situation in Vilnius differed a little bit from the situation in the countryside in Lithuania, because in the big cities the Soviet control was stronger. They could actually more or less control the city and its population, and resistance, as you know, perhaps was much stronger in the woods, in the countryside. So there, Soviets basically did not all the time control the situation. And it was the big difference between Vilnius and between the countryside, because there Soviets destroyed the resistance only in 1953. So that outside the city was even dangerous, and it was for Soviets, because Lithuanian partisans could, for instance, attack them if they would decide to build this mass grave place somewhere in the woods or somewhere in the countryside. And that was only another reason why they chose the territory, which is of course secret, but within the city, not outside the city, because it was too dangerous for the Soviets at that time. There were partisan activities and so on. And of course, the situation was difficult because many people were persecuted by the Soviet regimes, and nobody could actually feel safe during this after-war period.
How is the museum organized, and what are its goals?
This museum belongs to a bigger structure, to the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania, and the research center administrates this museum and the so-called KGB museum, other museums, so it's a part of a bigger structure. The decision to find a memorial place in this site was taken in 2002 by Lithuanian government. In 2008, it became a part of the research center, Genocide Research Center. What else should be said? That it is not only this small museum, but it is a memorial site as a big complex, together with the so-called Tuskule Peace Park, the Columbarium. We have a big exposition, and another hall of conferences and so on. So many different events are taking part here. What is important, what is the mission of this museum? It is of course, to preserve the memorial site, to preserve the site where the mass grave was. Another very important reason why it is found here is, of course, to commemorate and to honor the victims, those people who were killed here, and to have this kind of memory about the Soviet repressions, about how inhuman system it was. And also another goal is education, especially of a youngest generation, of young people, and therefore many educational activities are taking part. Here, exactly in Tuskule, there are educational programs organized by the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania. So educators work with school children, with students. They play some games, educational games. There is even the computer games. So many different methods to educate people and also to spread the knowledge about this part of history, about this period of history. So that's why many events are also organized here, like historical conferences, like film screenings, film festivals, music concerts. In many, many different ways, this place is actually active, very alive. It's a part of Vilnius cultural life and a part of Vilnius scientific life. So it's a lively place, and I think its goal is more or less completed. And also what is important to say that now we have this exhibition, smaller exhibition, which is dedicated to the history of Tuskulėnai as a manner and later history as a part of Soviet repressive system to the victims, as you can see. And there is also an explanation who the victims were, who were the perpetrators, why people were killed, and so on. So all this information you can find here in this museum, but also actually a new museum is being constructed at the moment, and it will be a little bit different. It will be also in Tuskulėnai in another building, and it will be called the Homo Sovieticus Museum, and its goal is to show everyday life and many different stories of people who were living during the Soviet times. Not only who became victims, but also just random people how their lives were destroyed by the regime, or maybe they found some strategies how to find their happiness even during the Soviet time. So there will be many different levels, how dissidents lived, how nomenclatura lived and members of the Communist Party, and how just random people lived, and which were the strategies to survive under the totalitarian and post-totalitarian regime in this new museum. And this new museum will also cover much longer period, because this smaller covers only Stalinist period and mostly dedicated to repressions, and this new will be dedicated to many aspects of life. But under the Soviet regime, until 1990, until perestroika, basically. But what is important about this new museum, that it shows how the Soviet system wanted to transform everybody in the society to the so-called Homo Sovieticus, Soviet people who, a person who had to act according to Soviet ideals. And the message of the museum will be whether this actually succeeded or failed, and in which ways this Homo Sovieticus was or was not actually created by this utopian Soviet ideology.
Yeah. Who has not lived an occupation and the totalitarian regime like that of the Soviet regime, he cannot understand what it means exactly. You're a child in the last years of the occupation, but your parents lived all the regime. Could you try to tell any memories of your family, and how do people change under a hard and repressive regime lasted 50 years?
Well, the story of my family was a very special story, actually, because in the interwar period, my grandparents, they were teachers, and my grandfather, he was a school director. And actually, it was an enemy group for the Soviet regime, even at that time, because they were educated people and they were in favor of independent Lithuania. And there were many attempts to deport them, but somehow, luckily, one time they somehow managed to escape, another time they managed to escape, and they survived and they were not deported. But my grandfather had to change his name in the documents, to live with the fake documents. Of course, he could not be again the school director. He had to work very physical, hard hard jobs, very, very simple jobs and so on. So that was the life. Also, my grandfather actually had to suffer but luckily survived during the Nazi regime because he lived in Marijampolė at that time, another Lithuanian city, and he signed some protest document, anti-Nazi, it was against Nazi repressions, and he had to be taken to Stuttgart. He was already arrested with a group of other people when he was working there as a teacher, but somehow he also managed to escape. He jumped from the window of his school because he was arrested during the exam. He had to give exam for his students, but then Nazi came, arrested him, and then he just jumped through the window and ran away. So my family was, on the one hand, was very, very lucky because not so many Lithuanian families were lucky at that time. At least, of course, they lost their jobs, wealth, houses, and so on, but they at least survived, even losing their property and so on. And maybe because of this experience of my grandparents, my parents also was a special case, and they were also had these oppositional moods already from their young years, student years. Later, my father participated in 1987 protest demonstration next to the Adam Mickiewicz monument in Vilnius, very famous protest demonstration, and the first demonstration which was not harshly suppressed by the Soviets, so already perestroika period, but he was active also in some underground circles together with my mother during the earlier Soviet times, not before the perestroika. So I was always a kid who was raised actually in this kind of a little bit maybe patriotic mood, patriotic not to the Soviet Union, of course, but to Lithuania. I knew the memories and the story of my family. And it was also not so common because, as I know, even some deportees never told the stories to their children that they were deported because they were afraid. And of course, I was born in 1985, so it's already the period of perestroika, and maybe that's why there was more freedom, and my parents were not afraid to tell for me my family's story, and I have only very bright memories, if to be honest, about this period, because I remember the huge meetings and demonstrations of Sąjūdis, of Lithuanian Reformation movement, so I don't have bad Soviet memories. Of course, I remember that there were, for instance, some products lacking and my mother had to run to the shops to find some meat or something. Yes, this aspect somehow I remember, but more I have this bright memories of Sąjūdis, because I was living in Vilnius and my parents were always taking me with them, and they also told the story that I was somehow learned maybe from their friends to sing some patriotic songs and even the anthem of Lithuania, and I was doing it in public transportation, being a kid, maybe 3 years old or something, and then they said, "Oh, be quiet, daughter, we are still living in the Soviet regime, maybe something could happen." So, but yes, but my family story is different. And of course, many stories were destroyed and were not so lucky as my own. And of course, from my not really from my grandparents' families, but some other relatives were deported, and I knew their stories as well, and they suffered during the war. For instance, my parents had to run away to America during the war, so our family was touched in one or another way. And what else to be said? How people, I don't know, how the Soviet regime actually destroyed lives of people, even in not this brutal way, but in some other way. So as I mentioned, my grandparents were some kind of elite in the interwar period, but after the war they lost their jobs. In later Soviet times they were allowed to teach finally, so they were very happy that they can again, after the death of Stalin, work according to their profession. It was very important for them, but for instance, my grandmother, she had a very strong faith, but she never went to church because she knew if she go to church, she will lose her job immediately, and she wanted to at least give some some positive things to her pupils, to her students, and that's why she decided to go in this compromise with her own conscience. And she, when she was older, she said she felt very bad about this, that she could not live openly a Christian life. And so it is just a small part, but many people had to make compromises with their own consciousness, or to go in active opposition, where they, of course, were then discriminated, and even in later Soviet times they had to go on trial and be deported and to experience all this. So it was not only Stalin times which destroyed life, but also the whole Soviet period.
Thank you, Monica.